Simon had always wanted a nickname. When he worked on the trawlers with the other fishers as a young person, he practiced with the knife until he could clean the catch quickly and efficiently and correctly without ever cutting into his hands. And he hinted to the other fishers that in light of this skill, a nickname was perhaps appropriate. Perhaps he could be Nimble Fingers or Sling Blade or even Fish Cutter Sai. But the other fishers either didn't listen or didn't care, and so Simon, he remained. Simon thought this was unfair because most of the other fishers had nicknames, almost all of them. There was Big Dave, so named for obvious reasons. If you needed something large picked up and moved, Big Dave was your guy. There was Woody, who got that name for a reason that no one could remember, except it fit him so perfectly. And then there were the people who had names that only their immediate family were permitted to call them. Simon once or twice had heard Mrs. Zebedee call James Pookie. But woe betide anyone who was not Mrs. Zebedee who called James Pookie. This was how to get thrown over the side of the boat. All of these names, all of these nicknames notwithstanding, a nickname was not forthcoming for Simon. He was Simon still on the day that Jesus came and said, "Follow me, and I will make you a different kind of fisher." And so he went, and the other fishers with Jesus traveled the land. They were no longer on boats most of the time. They were mostly walking now. And Simon was there as Jesus healed people. He was there as he cast out demons. He was there as he hosted meals, so many of which began in scarcity and ended with leftovers. And he was there as Jesus told his inspiring and confusing stories. Simon was always one of the first people at the side of the mountain that was going to become the amphitheater for the crowds. And he heard the stories over and over again. But notwithstanding the repeated hearing, he remained as inspired and as confused as anyone by what Jesus had to say. One day the fishers traveled to a place named for the king, named for the ruler of the occupying forces. It was called Caesarea. Perhaps we could call it Kingland in our language. And it was there that Jesus asked the fishers a question. Now, Jesus asking questions was not a surprise. Questions were Jesus' first language. The baptism of John, did it come from heaven or from earth? Do you want to be made well? Can you add one day of life by worrying? So Simon was accustomed to questions. The other fishers were accustomed to questions. And Jesus posed one to them. He said, "Who do people say that I am?" And the fishers had their answer at the ready. They had been listening carefully to the crowds. And they said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah, some say another one of the prophets. In those days, people understood the veil between this world and the next one to be thinner than we understand it today. The possibility of a prophet coming back was always there. But Simon knew that this question was this answer was too abstract, that it was too academic, that it was at an intellectual reserve, and it did not touch the hearts of the fishers. He knew Jesus would push harder, and indeed he did. Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" The silence that followed was excruciating. It probably objectively was not that long. If someone had been there with an hourglass and started timing, probably only a handful of grains would have fallen from the top to the bottom. But to live it, that silence felt like forever, and Simon knew he had to speak up. Not just because the silence was so intense, but because he knew the answer. He did not wish to repeat his behavior from back in school when he knew the answer to the math question, but he did not put his hand up because he was embarrassed of being laughed at. And so into the silence, he blurted out, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." Simon knew that Jesus, not the one for whom this place was named, was the King. Immediately having blurted out these words, Simon blushed hard. He didn't need a mirror to see that his face was scarlet red. He saw Jesus looking at him with an expression he could not read on his face. So often in Jesus' eyes, there was something that sat at the intersection of kindness and challenge and mischief. And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon. You've seen things, heaven has revealed them to you. From now on, I'm calling you Rocky." Rocky being, in this ancient language, the name Peter. Years later, when Simon, who was Rocky, would remember this moment, he would remember as well something the elders said when he was growing up. And what the elders said was this: be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. He had wished for a long time for a nickname, and as he had traveled with the other fishers across the land, he'd begun to forget about the nickname. But here this old wish was made true, and Simon Rocky was not sure that he wanted this wish granted. Because remember, he'd been listening over and over to the inspiring and confusing stories that Jesus told. And he had listened as Jesus said, the rocky soil, that's where the seed falls and it grows for a little while, but it has no depth. The roots don't go down because there is rock beneath. And thus, when the heat of the day comes, the plants fail. And Simon wondered if that's what Jesus had meant. There were ways, indeed, in which he had failed when the heat came. He remembered sitting outside of the occupying forces' headquarters where Jesus was being kept after Jesus had been taken. And he remembered someone asking him, "Are you one of his disciples?" And Simon, who had sworn he would never, ever deny Jesus, said, "I'm not." He denied it 3 times. Maybe he was Rocky. Maybe things did not grow in him. And he remembered as well, later on, after the cross, after the women found the tomb empty, after the mystery that was resurrection, standing with Jesus on the beach. His old teacher still had the wounds of the cross on his body. And Jesus asked Simon, "Do you love me?" And Simon said, "I do." And Jesus asked him again, "Do you love me?" And Simon said, "I do." And Jesus asked him a 3rd time, Do you love me? And Simon said, I do. 3 times to undo or reverse the denial outside of the headquarters. And remembering that time on the beach, Simon remembered as well what Jesus had said to him when he gave him the nickname. You're rocky, and on you I will build my church. It is a powerful thing, a dangerous thing to get a new name. There are times when we enter into a change and a new name comes to us. When we get married, we take on the new name of spouse. In baptism, we take on the new name of Christian. And sometimes we get a name from our friends. And these names, all of them, say to us, I see you. I see you and I know you. And Simon, now looking back on these events from years after they took place, wondered if this complicated name that he got from Jesus might not be good news after all. Because there were ways in which he was rocky, in which it was hard for things to grow within him. But there also were ways in which he was so solid. And he was trusting in that second part now, trusting that it was his job, unqualified though he was, to build up his old teacher's church. He was fishing still, building things still. It was his job to create a foundation. His job, Simon, who was rocky, to build a foundation and invite things onto earth as it is in heaven.